we're really going to be on mission and reach the world, like there's so many cultures and subcultures, there's so many groups of people that exist, that if we're just running a program and trying to either entice people to come to us, which isn't a bad thing, I'm not saying anything against that, but I think it's far more effective if we can empower each person to see you're made uniquely. You have unique relationships, and whether that's where you live, whether that's where you play, whether that's where you work, you have unique relationships that nobody else is going to have. And especially if we're using our interests, you're going to be able to plug into a community that, nobody else has that in with. And that's how we take the gospel, right, and spread it to all different parts of community and culture. And when we don't do that, I think we run the risk of missing big segments of the population, or giving up our missional opportunities, but also our prophetic voice, right, of being the church who speaks into culture.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Sowers Podcast. My name is Matt Naismith, and I am your host. This podcast features stories of Canadian church planters and leaders who are influencing kingdom movement and impacting their communities. Whether you're a church planter, pastor in a church, part of a church planting team, or someone just wanting to learn more, we pray you get inspired to become a sower in the places where you live, work, learn, and play. We pray this is a blessing to you, and if it is, we would ask you to share links to episodes, subscribe on whatever platform you are using. With that, let's get to our next conversation. Welcome, friends, to the Sowers Podcast. My hope and prayer is that as you listen to this episode, that you would be inspired and encouraged to become a sower of the gospel in the places where you live, work, learn, and play. Today's episode features a conversation that I had with Jason McGibbon. Jason McGibbon has been playing and working and living in Hamilton for 10 years, and he's loved every minute in the city. Jason is married to his wife, Kimberley, and they've raised 4 kids in the city of Hamilton. Jason has been involved in church planting in some capacity over the last 20 years, and he gives leadership to the Hamilton Fellowships, their flagship church in Hamilton. Jason also authored the study of the 5 marks of a disciple, exploring leadership through Jesus' words, which you can find on Amazon. This book puts on paper his heart to make disciples who make disciples. Jason and I talk about the creative arts, as Jason and his family are exceptionally creative. And so you're going to hear a little bit more about that. Well, friends, without further ado, here is that conversation that I had with Jason McGibbon. Well, Jason, thank you so much for taking the time today to be a part of the Sowers Podcast. I've been looking forward to having a conversation with you for quite a while. I was wondering, Jason, if you could begin sharing with us your passion for music. I heard you playing the electric guitar at a retreat recently, and it is clear to me and probably to all of those that listen that you have been playing for quite some time.
Yeah, actually, and I didn't start playing guitar. I think I started playing drums, and so a little before high school, and then that kind of bug took over, and that was most of my high school was doing music, and my brother played guitar, and I played drums, and we had I was just really fortunate to get into some bands with some musicians who were just incredible. And so it made it a really fun time. And so I spent most of my time, to be honest, I studied music after high school, went to college and studied it. So my wife laughs and says that when we got in a relationship, she thought she was getting in a relationship with a musician and not a pastor, certainly not a church planter. And so so God kind of shifted that, but music still has always been a big part of what I did. Did a lot of worship leading early on, and but still is part of what we do. My kids are very musical, my family's musical, so we actually just wrote sort of a musical. We did an album we just finished recording that we'll release this year, all about times in my grandpa's life that he almost died, so kind of a weird album, but we wrote a stage show that goes with it. And so we're going to have a big announcement with that coming up. So still always tried to maintain that as a part of what I'm doing, partly just because I love to do it, and partly because that's the most natural mission opportunities that I have. I'm big into integrating instead of trying to add on. And so if there's just natural ways to create mission opportunities, that's where I want to try to do it. So yeah, so I've been playing for a while.
So with that, share with us this integration philosophy, and maybe share how that is, I would assume in some ways connected to your own journey of discipleship and walking in relationship with Christ. So even begin to share with us a little bit of that story in connection to this integration of mission and of the things you love to do, and how that can be a blessing to those around you.
I think for me, I was really fortunate in that, there's always that sort of joke about, fear of coming to Jesus, and then all of a sudden you're going to have to be a missionary to Africa or something, who's going to completely change everything about who you are and all of your story and all of that kind of stuff. But I was really fortunate that, my life, like before I came to faith, like I was a pretty good student, so I liked school. Music was massive, huge part of who I was, and that was starting to include songwriting and all of that kind of stuff. So, and then, had a tight group of friends. And how I came to faith was just hitting a time in life where all of those things, right, if those were like the three legs of a stool or whatever, all of them at the same time got taken away. So my close group of friends, we all moved on, the band I was playing with all moved on, and school, like I'd finished one and sort of was thinking about what was next, went to university, realized I hated history. I like random facts of unuseful knowledge, love that kind of stuff. But actually the War of Roses was not interesting at all to me. So for the first time, I was like, oh, school was boring. I hated it and wasn't doing particularly well. God used that next season really to grab hold of me and to take some of that stuff that I'd never considered before. I'd gone to a youth group in high school, but never took this spiritual stuff very seriously. So it had this time where everything else was kind of removed, and it was just a great time to focus in on that stuff. And over this period of just recognizing that Jesus is real, he is who he said he was, and, of coming to faith, the next part of the journey for me, I got to start working with, youth groups that I'd been a part of in the past, and music was a big part of it. My father-in-law had started this youth group, and he, for years, wrote musicals for them to do. And so, like, I got to step into that, and all of a sudden, music became a big thing. I was writing music and writing musicals and helping kids, and I was teaching lessons. And then all of that, though, was in this new context with a new purpose. And so I think that grounding for me just helped to go, when we can talk about evangelism and being missional, we can talk about adding things on or trying to do more programs or trying to go out or we can figure out what are the rhythms that we live, who has God created us to be, what are the things that are integral to who we are, and try to integrate it into that. I mean, it's going into the harvest field, right? Wherever, just trusting that God has you where he has you for a reason. And for such a time as this, there's a purpose to who you are and where you are. And for me anyway, I'm kind of an introverted guy. I'm not really boisterous. I'm not super, super outgoing. And so opportunities to create relationships over which, becomes, creates that bridge for the gospel message to travel becomes really, important for me. And so finding people with common interests and working together is the most natural, thing.
I think something you're touching on is actually something unique to the podcast, which is how God uses the things that we're interested in, our hobbies or our some of our innate gifting and abilities. I know I had one conversation at one point with someone who's really into basketball, and God just keeps putting them back in basketball gyms, and they're coaching now, and it's a ways for connecting with the community. Speak more to the value of tapping into your hobbies and interests, and how God has even potentially given you those gifts or those abilities or those interests as a way of connecting on mission.
Absolutely. And I think that's really important for all of us to think through, right? For me, it happens to be music and doing some writing. And like I've just recently realized, I just wrote this show with my family. It's not like a faith-based show or whatever, but it's given me opportunities. I'm connecting with a whole new community, right? And I started my whole faith journey writing musicals for a youth group, and now I'm kind of going back to it. So it's kind of weird in that way. It's like those things just keep coming back, right? But if we're really going to be on mission and reach the world, there's so many cultures and subcultures. There's so many groups of people that exist that if we're just running a program and trying to either entice people to come to us, which isn't a bad thing. I'm not saying anything against that, but I think it's far more effective if we can empower each person to see you're made uniquely. You have unique relationships, and whether that's where you live, whether that's where you play, whether that's where you work, you have unique relationships that nobody else is going to have. And especially if we're using our interests, you're going to be able to plug into a community that nobody else has that in with. And that's how we take the gospel, right, and spread it to all different parts of community and culture. And when we don't do that, I think we run the risk of missing big segments of the population or giving up our missional opportunities, but also our prophetic voice, right, of being the church who speaks into culture. And so if we retreat a little bit and always just hang out together, but we're not empowering people to go, then there's whole pockets, of the community that have no faithful witness. And whether that's in word and in deed of sharing the gospel, we're just missing huge pockets, right? And so whether you're into some video gaming which I don't totally get, I need somebody else to do that. But I know there's community built around those things, and where there's community, we need faithful witness in those communities. And so I think it's really important to help everybody see that what you're interested in can have really, huge impacts for the kingdom.
Speak to the value then of hobbies. A question that I'll ask somebody when I'm hanging out with them for the first time is, hey, what's one of your hobbies? And I don't know if it's unique of pastors or church planters, but very few have hobbies. And maybe it's because of maybe more people don't have hobbies, but the most people that I'm talking to are within that category, pastors or church planters. Not many of them have hobbies. And in many ways, it's because of the busyness that's existing within their work life or their personal life, or they just never struck up a hobby, or maybe they had one in high school and then just didn't continue it. Speak to the need for the human person of having something that is this hobby.
Yeah. Sometimes when you talk to creatives, you realize it's not even just a hobby. There's just this need within, like this drive to be creating in some way, right? And so I do music, I paint, and all those kind of things. But I think for all of us, that there's a number of reasons why something like a hobby can be really important. One is that it can and should be a bit of a break from the usual, right? We talk about different ways of resting and all of that kind of stuff. And rest can be literal rest. It can be sleeping in or whatever, all of those kind of things. But I think that having somewhere else to invest some time and energy and to focus on, like I know when I paint, I tend to drown out everything else. I get so kind of focused in on it that it becomes kind of a restful place, because I'm doing something else, but it's also occupying my hands and my mind, and it gives me a bit of a rest, part of Sabbath keeping and all of that kind of stuff, which I think is hugely important. If there's never a mental break from ministry, as probably goes with any job, but especially with ministry, that's a key recipe for sort of burnout and being over, committed both emotionally and mentally, and just leading to burnout and fatigue. The other then is the missional aspect, right? Oftentimes our hobbies will connect us with a different group of people that we ordinarily might not just come across in our everyday life. And so the more opportunities we have to hang out with different people with common interests, which allows for relationships, and relationships I think are key for sharing the gospel, especially in today's culture. Sometimes people want to know that they trust someone before they're going to trust anything that they're saying, or they want to trust that you have their best in mind. And so it takes a while to build a relationship, to know that you're actually in their corner and you have the best in mind. So when you share stuff, they hear it as coming from an honest and genuine place. And so hobbies create an opportunity to build those relationships. Instead of trying to force relationships, and just sometimes I think evangelism, when we think about it distinct from anything else, can feel like a little bit of a using people or a notch in the belt kind of thing. I think hobbies give us that avenue to make sure we're avoiding that. We're actually building honest relationships with people with a common interest. And then when you know the people and you have something in common, hopefully and likely they're people that you relate to. So when it comes time and it comes to sharing the gospel, if you understand their context, some of their interests, if you understand some of where they're coming from, it makes it a lot more direct to figure out, hey, here's the gospel is the answer to this, just to contextualize it. Here's what you're facing. Here's how you're thinking. Here's how the gospel is the answer to whatever question you're asking.
Friends, we'll get back to my conversation with Jason McGibbon in just a moment. Prior to that, however, I want to let you know about Jason's book, The 5 Marks of a Disciple, Exploring Discipleship Through Jesus' Words. In Jason's own words, he says that there was a season when he was really feeling like something was missing in how he was leading others to follow Jesus. He said that it wasn't a lack of access to materials or Bible studies or information. He said there was a lot of bookstores in the dawning of the internet age. There was a plenty of resources, but for some reason, each of these resources seemed to be missing the mark. Around the same time, there was a gentleman in his church who'd spent over 18 years as a missionary overseas. And one day, Jason asked him what he used to disciple others without access to the endless resources and pre-internet. This gentleman, Mike, smiled and answered, the Bible. And then Jason asked if he would mentor him and walk him through how he did discipleship. Jason's book, The 5 Marks of a Disciple, is the result of that mentorship journey and learning from Mike Hampton. If you'd like to learn more about the 5 Marks of a Disciple, exploring discipleship through Jesus' words, you can find it on Amazon, and there'll be a link to the book in this episode's show notes. And now back to my conversation with Jason McGibbon. How have you, over the years, I'm interested if you could give us a little bit of an apologetic as well to pastors and to churches, to people that are part of churches that are listening to this podcast, and how have you found the church, at least the ones that you've been a part of, how receptive have they been to creatives? It sounds like one of the first ones you were in, you were writing musicals for them, but I haven't seen that broadly when I think about the church. And I know that at times there can be this disconnect between creatives in a church community and how the church is functioning. So have you seen that? And then what would be a few pieces of advice that you would give to a pastor leader who's listening to this and say, hey, you need to think about the creatives in your community?
Yeah, it's always a tension, I think. Like, I've been really fortunate that in any of the churches that I've been in, now having said that, I've been in leadership in a lot of them, so a little bit it comes from that. But they've been very open and receptive to bringing creative elements into it, even if they're not creative themselves. They've been really generous in that way. I think the tension when thinking about art and arts and creatives is a little bit of this sort of, again, we talked about it, but sort of integration and all that kind of stuff. But when we're thinking missionally, to think a bit broader, and also creatively to think a bit broader. When the church thinks, I think sometimes of creating or creative, it's art with a cross in it, or this isn't a bad place to start, but it's musicians playing on the worship team. It's drama in a service. That's one element of it, and that's one important one. I think there's opportunities to create lots of like worship opportunities to include the arts in it. But then I think there's the other side of just encouraging them in a bigger picture to see how their art really can work in a missional way. One is it creates, like we've been talking about, relationships to bring a gospel witness into conversations. But I think anytime that you're creating beauty, I was reading Surprised by Joy just again, a book, and one of the things that said, missionally, what is the church, should it be about? It's concluded things like beauty, justice, and evangelism, right? But that bigger picture of the church being a foretaste of the coming kingdom and representing God's heart in the world, both here and now as the kingdom that's here, but also as, if your theology is of a restored kingdom in the future, then leaning into those things that we know are part of God's heart and will be there. And so if we see beauty in a landscape as, a reason to worship the Creator, then taking time to capture that and to bring beauty into the world, to help the world pause long enough to say, hey, see this image that ordinarily we'll just drive by or walk by, you might miss it. Hey, don't miss this. This is a moment, So again, it's not art necessarily with a cross in it, or it's not just worship music, but it's helping us to work on some of those things that are important in God's eyes too, right? If God is the creator, the great creator, if we're made in the image of God, then I think part of what it means to be human then in living in the image of God is to reflect that creation, to celebrate the creator, I think to live in imitation of the creator. And art has I hate to use the term prophetic voice because I don't want to, that can mean so many things to different people, but it does give us, art can be used to give us pause to see things in the world, both good and bad. And so I think here's where the struggle is a little bit sometimes. Get a little bit nervous about artists who are trying to make a statement with their art, per se, but I think there's some realities, the Syrian war and the refugee plight, what was it that really sunk that into the, made it real to a lot of people? It was when they finally saw an image of a young child dead on the beach, right? There was something that piece of art and the photography, as art really captured and brought forth, that captured people's hearts and imaginations in a way that just news articles and stuff didn't. And so I think there's an important thing. And so for the church to embrace creatives and to see these different aspects of art, right? Living in imitation of the creator, worshiping, I often think of the Psalms, like how many, think of the Psalms that looks at something about either God's character or looks at something in nature, and it brings them to a place of worship. And then what was the response? It was to write a poem to capture that moment, right? That's what the Psalm is, when it's talking about nature and it's worshiping, and then they use art to capture that. Like, there's so many moments like that. And to help us bring in a prophetic voice, meaning to speak a Christian worldview into what we see and to comment on it and help the church, but also the world see the beauty, but also to see the brokenness and call us to respond to it in somehow. It's kind of a long, rambly answer. I don't know if it was succinct enough.
No,
I think
it's helpful. I'm thinking of Van Gogh's painting. I think it's called Starry Night. And the yellows were to symbolize hope, light. And there is this church that exists within the small town of the scene that he has painted. And there is no yellow or light coming from the church, but it's coming from a lot of the other places. And that is if like what I've just shared is the background of that painting, that is a profound prophetic word to the church.
Absolutely.
Do the people in your city see light, hope, joy, restoration, peace? Or when they look at you, do they not see anything at all? Do they even know you exist?
Yeah, absolutely. And the other element about art that's important is that like every culture has some kind of art. And if we're going to bring the gospel message in a contextual way to the cultures around us, one of the ways in which we have to be engaged is in the stories that the culture is telling about itself. And so, and part of what I try to do is to read fiction at the same, all the time, reading leadership books and theology, but to try to make sure that I'm reading fiction as well, because that's people telling stories about themselves. And yes, it means that we're going to come up against things that are from a different worldview. And I think we need to be mindful of that. We have to go in with our eyes open. But also, I can't think of a better way to learn about what the culture thinks and how to make the gospel make sense to them than to hear the stories that they're telling. We learn the worldview through that way. I think of Paul when he's speaking at the Areopagus, and that's always the big one about contextualization. I see there's a statue to an unknown God. So he's engaging with their art. But then he goes on to quote some of their poets. So not only is he familiar with the statues, but he's enough engaged with the culture to know that their poets have been writing things. And so to use that, he's obviously familiarized himself with the culture and the stories that they're telling about themselves, and then is able to then bring a gospel message in that makes sense and answers some of the questions that they are asking, which I think is huge. Our best sharing of the gospel is when it answers questions they're actually answering. Lots of times I think we seek to answer questions that they're not asking, and so we wonder why there's a disconnect, or why some methods that may have worked years ago are struggling to work now. And then there's always the reality that I say all of this, and then there's the stories of where the world changes so fast. It's what you think is some so old, antiquated way of doing things reaches somebody like you never thought would be reached. And so I think we just need to be open to thinking about how do we make the gospel make sense to people. And it's not new, old, one way or the other. It's learning, right? Always constantly trying to learn about the culture and being engaged with the culture and speaking into the culture.
Well, something that you also pointed to there is that art is so embedded in different cultures and ethnicities and people groups. So I think another just benefit in building the kingdom of God in a city, in a church, is finding ways to celebrate art from different cultures that can then represent different peoples of the world. And it's then a potential way that you can connect and participating in a multi-ethnic church. I'm thinking right now our kids are out of school and there's a multicultural night coming up at the school. And so they've sent home application forms that different families from different cultural backgrounds and ethnicities can fill out and have a table to represent their ethnicity and culture. Like, it seems like a really lovely idea, that even something that wouldn't be very hard for a church to do. So also there seems to be this way in which we can also reach cultures. How have you seen that at play in the different ministries that you've been part of? As far as I'm aware, many of them being in the Greater Toronto area, now in Hamilton. How has creating environments of art and expressive ways of cultures coming out also created pathways into different people groups?
All cultures have a couple of things in common. One is music, or art, and food. Mm-hmm. And so had opportunities to do both of those kind of things. I've had, we used to do this thing in the last church plant that I helped to do in Milton called Taste the World. And we just, we were a pretty multicultural congregation. And so we would host a night where people would make food from their different cultures, and then slowly, began to be able to offer some entertainment at it too. And so, we had some just people come up and do, sing and all that kind of stuff. But then, for example, we had Irish dancers come out. And so that was a lot of fun, actually. Like, I got to play for them. My friend and my good buddy is a fiddle player. And so we played fiddle tunes and for the dancers, and just kind of got chairs and put it in the middle of the place and just gathered around, and really fun time, and had, people love watching kids dance for one thing, but then, they come out with all the costumes, and it was just this really kind of beautiful mix of all the different kind of foods and cultures, and people being encouraged to celebrate their culture through food and music and all those kind of things. But because each culture has those in common, those just become bridges, right? For relationships to happen, for interaction to happen. Music is a great one because there's so much that cultures have in common, but then the styles of music are so different. So to be able to listen and engage and learn from it creates an opportunity to learn from one another, which is maybe that's a piece of missional evangelism that sometimes we miss, where we always think about information transferring one to the other. I have the gospel, you're going to share it with people. But when you can create avenues of learning from one another, I think the relationships become deeper. People feel more valued, and doing things together is always a much richer experience than one just pouring on to the other, right? And so building community where everybody has a voice and has a place to be needed and to share. And so learning from one another creates those opportunities, and things that we have in common, food, music, art, become great opportunities for that.
You have, I think, we've only known each other for about 14 months, but from what I've heard, you and Kim have fostered an environment of creativity within the context of your own home. You shared already in this conversation that as a family, you're releasing an album, you've written a musical together.
Yeah.
As a dad with 3 kids, wanting to see my kids flourish and each of the things that they have as natural abilities. One of my kids is just very naturally gifted athletically, so he'll probably go down the athletic route, but
right.
He also has some interests in creativity and arts and music. And my other son loves to write and to read. How do you create an environment? I know every family is different, but what are some of the non-negotiables that you would say that you and Kim have committed to help foster creativity within the context of your own home?
Yeah, and I'd have to give, like, genetically speaking, sort of environmentally speaking, a lot of the creative stuff might come from my side. I have a pretty creative family. You know, my brother's a professional actor. My aunts and uncles are professional musicians. I have other cousins and uncle who is a phenomenal painter. He actually painted what's going to be our album cover. But spent years in movies doing matte painting and special effects. And I have, actors and dancers. And so just a lot of that. And that's on my mom's side. And then my dad's side, my dad was like a virtuoso classical singer when he was young and like on the radio all the time. And so there's a lot of that just naturally that comes there. But I have to give, props to my wife. She's really good. Her big thing is she always says to our kids, but also to people, is that you got to do what makes your heart beat fast. And so she's really created an environment where all of us all the time are encouraged to work on what, our passions are and what makes our heart beat fast. And I think that has been the bedrock of sort of what our kids, I have 4 kids, 2 adopted kids and 2 biological kids. And we've tried to do that for all of them. And so, our oldest daughter, Daniel's the oldest, and then Caroline, and she just got married a couple of years ago. And so she works with children. She's an early childhood educator, but that's what makes her heart beat fast. And so we just really encouraged that. And she was able to go study that and really, and I mean, God was at work there, I think, too, but with my wife's leading and encouragement, like she just seemed to get into that field pretty quickly and got onto the school board and has really loved her time. But that's what makes her heart beat fast. So it's not just creativity. But yeah, then my other 2 kids are really creative. And my son Liam studied at Sheridan in music theater, and so loves music theater, but also is very involved just musically. He helped to record the album and did all the engineering for it and all that kind of stuff. And my youngest daughter, TJ, is, exploring music theater now, but she's been doing acting for a long time, since she was 5. So she's been on TV and movie sets and that kind of stuff. And so Kim spent a lot of time on movie and TV sets with her. And again, it created opportunities missionally that we never would have had before. Spiritual conversations with people that you never thought you'd ever meet, but to be sitting in the back room with, somebody that you're in a movie with, and all of a sudden these spiritual conversations come up. And when my daughter was younger, between 5 and 10, she could just naturally ask these spiritual conversations with no agenda. She was just interested in people. She loved people. And so it's pretty disarming when a 5 or 10-year-old asks you these spiritual questions. So my wife said, she'd find herself in these spiritual conversations with some pretty big stars and stuff like that. So it was pretty fun times. But again, it's just that commitment to saying, hey, we want to help you find what you're uniquely made for, help you explore what's God have for you. How has he made you? What's that maybe leading towards, and what makes your heart beat fast, and try to create an environment with as many opportunities as possible and encouragement without pushing, without becoming the stereotypical, hockey dad or whatever. I tried not to do that, even though my kids' passions, some of them lined up with mine. Like maybe I didn't do it all the best sometimes, but creating opportunities, like we never pushed them into lessons or whatever, but because it was a natural environment of that happening, it's just to let them pick up what they wanted to do and then encourage them to keep going with it when they did.
Sounds like what you've tried to do is figure out in tandem when discerning with God, saying, and your kids, of like, what is my kid gifted at? What do they long to do? And how do we help them see that that's the thing that God has maybe made them to do and be about? So often people can grow up, or sometimes they can be in a context of a church, as you said at the very beginning, where it's like, okay, if I'm going to become a Christian, I'm going to be a missionary on the other side of the world. And that happens with a number of people.
But if that's your calling, great, because we need missionaries everywhere.
Exactly. But probably for the majority of us, our calling is to pursue hobbies, pursue a vocation and a career that makes our heart beat fast, and do it all to the glory of God and the building of his kingdom.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I really think, like Leslie Newbegin used to talk about that idea of being a foretaste, right? And I think that studying that language was an idea was really helpful for me, is to see that missions really is all about who we are. It's everything that we do. It's not just the evangelism. It's evangelism and discipleship, but it's living who you are, right? When Paul said, offer yourselves as living sacrifices in Romans 12, it's kind of, living it's like your body. Everything you are is encompassed in your body. And so everything that we are is a part of mission, right? And so it's part of being that foretaste and hopefully creating opportunities for people to go, like, what is it that they have? What's the difference? But we have an opportunity to have a lot more people experience it when we are sending missionaries to every part of the culture and every little subculture that we can send people to, and to say, who are you? What fascinates you? What makes your heart beat fast? Maybe this is who God's created you to be for a purpose, and it fits into his wider mission. And through that, we have those opportunities to give those verbal sharing of the gospel.
In the church that I planted and pastored, we would do commissioning Sundays, and there would be commissioning Sundays for people going on mission trips, but we would do somewhat regularly a commissioning prayer where I would invite people to stand who are in the healthcare field, or ask the teachers to stand up, and the people that were around them, we would invite them to extend their hand, and we would pray for them as they were engaging on mission in those places. And some of that, then we were able to form some vocational groups of public school teachers able to get together and talk about how they were following Jesus, becoming more like him, doing what Jesus did within the context of the public school system, and truly trying to help people understand that, yes, there is a missionary calling to another culture and people group, but also as local people. And this podcast is all about sowing the seeds of the gospel in the places we live, work, learn, and play. And one of those significant places is the places that we work. How are you trying to foster this type of environment in the context of Hamilton Fellowships? And what are some ways that you think you can continue to grow in that and going into the future?
Yeah, I think we've always tried to encourage people, and that's it, where you live, work, and hang out, right? That could be the biggest opportunity that you have, especially work. you spend so much of your time at work, right, with those individuals. And so trying to link what you're doing and helping to see how that can be kingdom minded, again, like teachers or healthcare workers. I mean, when you're educating people, when you're healing people, I mean, those are pretty obvious connections to kingdom work. I think those are good. So to be able to bring a kingdom perspective and a kingdom voice into that is really important. And then there's always, someone said it to me once, there's always like those that you're serving, and there's always those watching how you serve. And so, at work, you both get to be doing work, but then you have coworkers and a bunch of people to watch how you're doing it. And so there's like all this opportunity for influence. And so we've tried to do that. We've tried to intentionally not have too many programs, but rather be focused on doing a few things, trying to do that well, and then encouraging people to see who they are. And we've used things like SHAPE and borrow that acronym for sure, but that's like walking people through seeing who God's made them to be, their spiritual gift, their heart, what they love, their abilities, what are they just naturally good at, their passions, and experience. I think experience is a huge one that sometimes we don't take for granted. It's fun to watch people. We'd have them kind of write out a really quick life story, but as they share those other things like their abilities and their passions, and then they write down their like a lifeline kind of thing, and to see the connections start to be made. Oh, all of these experiences that I've had make this all make sense. Oh, I think I can see a story that God's been writing, and I think if you think about the scripture as like the ultimate drama, right? It's like this huge epic story. And we're so privileged to get to play a part of it, and that God is writing all of our little plots to help people see how their subplot fits the larger drama, and to just see their part in this epic drama is pretty cool. So to help them see that and then start to live that out and recognize that, no, God is with me. God wants to use me. He wants all of us to be on mission with him. And so where he has me is probably there's something unique about who I am, where I am, and what God's doing, and who he's brought around me that he wants to use for the sake of his glory and his kingdom.
Jason, thank you for taking the time to be on the Sowers podcast today, and for sharing with us some of your experiences and helping us see something that maybe many of us who are listening haven't necessarily thought about before. So thank you. Well, my friends, I'm sure you would agree that there is much from this conversation with Jason that could be applied as this episode's action step. Something that was repeatedly going through my mind as I was having this conversation with Jason was the very frank and important reality that the people that are part of our communities are also part of all of these other smaller communities, whether that be at work, whether that be through a hobby or an interest. And many times when we think through a philosophy of ministry, we want to draw people. Essentially, what we end up doing is drawing them away from some of those sub-communities or some of those subgroups. And I think Jason's point and what he was talking about so extensively in this conversation was, how do we encourage the people that are part of our church to engage in those communities, but to engage in those communities with a lens of the kingdom of God and with a lens of bringing the gospel to that environment. And so here's what I want you to do. I want you to make a list and begin to write down ways in which you can encourage people that are part of your church family to be engaged in their subgroups and their sub-communities, and be bringing the narrative of the gospel and the kingdom of God to those places, instead of trying to pull them out of those places into programs of your church. I think this is deeply important as we think about becoming sowers of the gospel in the places where we live, work, learn, and play. Well, thanks again, everyone, for listening to this conversation. If it was challenging and encouraging to you, I'd encourage you to share it with somebody else. And now, friends, you're going to hear a clip from a conversation that will be released next week with David Poche.
the strongest or the deepest realizations I had is, first, I realized that I will not be able to really train disciples and multiply them if I'm not putting all my life down on the altar. I realized that behind all my thinking, is it too much? I realized that there was some part of me that was like some kind of not laziness, but not willing to pay the cost that it really cost.